So a name we're going to be hearing a lot of in this episode is Gunpei Yokoi. So those Game & Watch devices were actually the creator of this guy. He's the designer. We covered him a lot in the Super Metroid episode because he actually supervised development of that game. But he joined Nintendo in 1965 to work on toys, which is just wild to think about. Like, somebody joining 1965 and also like, you know, creating something that was in, the mid 90s that is like still beloved to this day, and it's wild. But we're gonna dive a little bit into his career because he is instrumental to the creation of the Game Boy. So during that early stint with Nintendo, he created an extending arm toy known as the Ultra Hand, which you may know as the name for the Tears of the Kingdom power, where you can grab things. So the Ultra Hand was like this toy that you could extend out and it would grab stuff and you could pull it back to you. So that Ultra Hand being named that in Tears of the Kingdom is a nice little homage to Mr. Yokoi. So that toy was actually very successful, as was the Beam Gun, which he co-created, and that ended up being the predecessor to the NES Zapper. He also created the Love Tester, which was a device that was said to measure a couple's compatibility. I don't know how accurate that would be, but it was a fun novelty, I'm sure. So after a successful run working on toys, Yokoi joined a new branch of Nintendo devoted to creating video games in 1974. So Yokoi was one of the first game designers at Nintendo, and I did a bunch of research on his history and the history of the Game Boy, and so I'll be pulling from several articles here. So the first one that I found was a story on The Escapist called Searching for Gunpei Yokoi from 2007. So in that, it talks about how Yokoi was on the Shinkansen bullet train, which runs up and down Japan, on the way home from work, and he looked over and noticed that there was this businessman who was just bored on the train. And, this is in the 70s, so there's not like, we don't have phones, we don't have really any kind of portable entertainment. So he had just one of those old school LCD calculators, and he was just pushing random buttons to pass the time and, like, I don't know, doing whatever it is you could do with those things. So this sparked the idea in Yokoi's mind, wondering if a portable gaming device might be popular among commuters like this. He actually preferred cheaper components, thinking that consumers would prefer affordable products with fun gameplay over expensive cutting edge technology. And Brian, does that sound familiar to you?
Sounds like those Tiger portable games.
I was thinking it sounds like Nintendo's current philosophy of
right. Oh, they're
affordable technology that emphasizes fun gameplay over cutting edge technology.
Yes. Does the philosophy sound the same? Yeah.
But yeah, like that philosophy is, I mean, I would say that's applied to every single Nintendo console since the Wii, but I would probably most notably on the Switch because, we talked about how like the Switch was pretty much an outdated piece of technology from a power perspective the day it launched. Like it didn't hold a candle to the Xbox One, or the PS4 that had come out years before, but because it was so versatile and had so many great games, it became this juggernaut, and it is like one of the top selling consoles of all time. So Yokoi called this lateral thinking with obsolete technology. I've seen a few translations. One says obsolete technology, one says withered technology. So just kind of like, yeah, we're thinking with how can we create greatness with this kind of older, more affordable tech? And that sounds like the Switch to me.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, while you were getting your blast processing on Sega Genesis, I was still hanging out on the NES, having a lot of fun with all their great games.
I mean, you could say the same thing was true for the N64, right? Like a lot of the developers and the platform holders were moving over to CD at that point. Sega had moved on to the Sega CD, and then eventually the Sega Saturn. PlayStation was just coming onto the scene. Both of those used CDs, and Nintendo was like, "No, we're going to stick with the cartridge and see what we can do out of that." And there were positives and negatives associated with that, but it's just another example of Nintendo kind of riding the wave of like this tried and true technology and kind of working to get the most out of it.
What's ironic compared to all the things we were just talking about is the N64 cartridges were ungodly expensive compared to PlayStation discs.
Yeah, that was the downside of it, honestly. So getting back to the handheld realm, the first Game and Watch, it was called Ball, and it came out in 1980, and then it was called Toss Up in the US. Ended up being one of the first major successes for Nintendo in the gaming sector. And then several additional Game and Watch devices with different games came out over the next few years. And the thing that is worth noting that every Game and Watch device was a separate individual game, right? So it wasn't like you bought one device and you could swap out cartridges or anything. That was not technology that Nintendo was utilizing at that point. So several games came out over the next few years, several Game and Watch devices, but Yokoi was pulled onto a new project as the supervisor of a brand new young designer named Shigeru Miyamoto. And in an Iwata Asks interview with for New Super Mario Brothers Wii, Miyamoto was like reminiscing on that era, and he said that Gunpei Yokoi was instrumental in explaining various game design conventions to him, and that Miyamoto also remembers that Yokoi went to bat for him early in his career. So, after Donkey Kong was a hit in arcades, they actually brought it to Game and Watch. But since it was more intricate than the previous Game and Watch titles, Yokoi had to figure out how to make it so that that game could be played without an arcade joystick. Because if you put an arcade joystick on this thing, it's not going to be portable. Do you know what the solution was, Bryan Vore?
Ooh, I don't think I do.
It was an innovative invention that was a plus sign shaped directional pad, or a D pad for short.
Oh man, they weren't on any other Game and Watch before then?
No, they were like little nubs almost.
Oh.
And it wasn't the first time a directional pad had been used in gaming, but it was the first time that we had seen the now iconic plus sign or cross design that Nintendo and pretty much every other console manufacturer has used in the time since.
Oh, was it like 4 separate dots before for
Yeah,
everybody
it
else?
was. Well, there were like some that were like circular. There were some that were like the separate buttons. But yeah, this was the first time that we had seen the plus sign uh, design. Plus sign
Okay.
design is a tongue twister.
Now, should we? It was Miyamoto came from a art background. Is that correct? And that's why he didn't really. I mean, no one. There was not like a game design school back then or anything, so no one really had that opportunity to like study gaming unless you were actively in a company, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I've talked to several developers from that era, and like, yeah, like even going into the '90s, there weren't really many game design courses. Like they were becoming more prominent than they were in the '80s, but like it was still kind of a rarity, and like a lot of people would just go for like programming, or they would go for like different kinds of like art backgrounds, like you said. But yeah, it wasn't really like a thing that was prominent in the early '90s at least, and it certainly wasn't prominent in like 1980 or whenever Miyamoto graduated. So yeah, I mean, it just seems like Gunpei Yokoi had learned through like trial and error and making these Game and Watch games, like how can you make a game that's fun, and imparted that wisdom on the young designers, one of which happened to be Shigeru Miyamoto.
Nice.
So shortly after that, Nintendo released its iconic home console, the Famicom, or the NES in the West, which also used that D-pad design. And this was also when Nintendo started using cartridge technology, which had been invented by electronic engineer Jerry Lawson in the 1970s. And this made it so that you could swap out games on existing hardware. And even though Nintendo experienced a ton of success with the NES, Yokoi actually had said over and over that he remained partial to handheld technology.
Mm.
So
Did old Jerry? Did he work for Atari, or who did he work for to
no,
implement
he
carts for the first
God, what
time?
was the name of the console that he helped design?
Was it
It
in
was like,
television?
no, it was something called like Channel F, the Fairchild Channel F.
Ah, yes, yes, yes.
So yeah, he was the inventor of cartridge technology. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He passed away in 2011. But yeah, he's one of the unsung heroes of video game like forefathers, I would say. Just creating the thing that we are still using to this day. The Switch uses cartridges. Um, and yeah, just an unbelievable legend that doesn't get enough shine there. That's why I wanted to make sure to shout him out on this episode as well, because I don't want to talk about like, oh, Nintendo first started using cartridges in the NES, and then like not touch on the man who made that all possible. So Nintendo continued to iterate on the Game & Watch form factor. I think I read that like over the first like 10 or 11 years of the Game & Watch's existence, they released 59 different Game & Watch devices,
Hmm.
which is a lot.
I
um,
wish I had at least one in the package still.
oh god, they did release those Game & Watch special editions. There's like the Super Mario Brothers and the Legend of Zelda ones, where it plays like the NES games on like a full color Game & Watch screen. I don't know if you remember that from like probably 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, I grabbed a couple. I grabbed those.
Oh man, I kind of wish I did. Those were cool. I don't think I'd ever play them, but they'd be cool things to have.
Yeah, they're pretty sweet. They got a nice. I know at least Zelda has a nice gold box, but maybe Mario does too. That might have
Mm.
been just the branding. But yeah, I wish they would have kept going with those. I mean, those are, I guess, they're two big iconic properties. But it would be fun to see that continue on.
Yeah, and I mean, they have paid homage to Game and Watch several times over the course of Nintendo's history. I mean, they still acknowledge how influential these devices are. So they continued iterating the form factor of the Game and Watch over the course of the 80s. So they gave versions with wider screens, they added the D-pad, they've created more advanced games. But then shortly after the NES arrived on Western shores in 1985, Nintendo Research and Development 1, which Yokoi was a part of, got to work on designing the next handheld gaming device. And as I mentioned before, his partner in crime for this venture was Satoru Okada, who acted as assistant director. And then I found a 2017 interview with Retro Gamer with Satoru Okada, and he had mentioned there was originally a huge disagreement between him and Yokoi about the direction that the Game Boy should go. And I found a quote from that interview on Internet Archive through a
Ooh,
now defunct site called Japanese Nintendo. And you ready for this? 'Cause it's kind of a long one, so buckle in a little bit.
okay.
Here's from Okada. Quote, "The Game Boy you know today actually had nothing to do with the one Yokoi had in mind. He saw the Game Boy as a direct follow-on from the Game & Watch, which meant a rather cheap toy without any real business model and no long-term ambition. To give you a clear comparison, Yokoi wanted a Game Boy that would have looked like the Microvision, which was that the old handheld device that they looked at back in the 70s when they were creating the Game & Watch, and would not have lasted more than one or two seasons. For instance, he did not care if there were third party editors or not. Furthermore, he only wanted quick games, quickly completed and quickly forgotten. I wanted the Game Boy to have more ambition, closer to what the R&D 2 team had managed with the Famicom, a machine built to last with hardware that was good enough to play a variety of quality titles. I was the assistant director of R&D 1, and we had many arguments over this. In the end, he gave in and angrily told me, "Okay, do what you want." I then asked him, "Fine, but are you giving me full responsibility?" And he said, "Yes." I made the Game Boy project my own. Yokoi gave his seal of approval. In the end, the Game Boy is much more similar to the Famicom than the Game & Watch. The hardware was good enough to offer a wide range of games, and we were ready to welcome third-party editors with real development kit, instruction booklets, some real support, etc. Gunpei Yokoi left Nintendo shortly after the failure of the Virtual Boy, which he created. In his time with Nintendo, on top of the stuff we covered in this episode, he also designed Duck Hunt, created the Super Scope, created Rob the Robot, and was a producer on Donkey Kong Jr., the original Mario Brothers, Balloon Fight, Metroid, Kid Icarus, several Fire Emblem games in the early era of that series, Dr. Mario, Metroid 2, Mario Paint, Super Mario Land 2, and Yoshi's Cookie. He also supervised development on Super Metroid, and he was with Nintendo for 31 years. After leaving in 1996, he formed a company called Koto and worked on a Bandai handheld called the Wonder Swan. And then, unfortunately, in 1997, he died just over a year after leaving Nintendo because he was involved in a fender bender on a Japanese highway and then was subsequently struck by another passing car. And he ended up dying shortly thereafter. So, absolutely tragic there. I found a 2006 interview with PC Watch, which, again, through Internet Archive, seemingly a defunct Japanese website. And this was with Satoru Iwata, former president, again, the late former president of Nintendo. He said, quote, "Nintendo had that way of thinking from the beginning. Yokoi, who created the Game Boy, left behind the phrase lateral thinking of obsolete technology. He said that you use obsolete technology and compete with ideas. Miyamoto also inherited that way of thinking because Yokoi was his mentor. It just so happened that I took on the role of president in this kind of era and found that such a tradition existed within the company. In that case, I thought that Nintendo, with its kind of corporate culture, should be the place for me to take on this role. Just kind of talking about the reason that he wanted to take his role as president. It sounds like Gunpei Yokoi was instrumental not only in Shigeru Miyamoto's career, but also in bringing Satoru Iwata over to Nintendo from HAL Laboratory to be Nintendo's president. So you look at the kind of the Mount Rushmore of Nintendo figures, and I think a lot of people probably think of like Miyamoto, Tezuka, Aonuma, and Iwata as kind of the most important figures in Nintendo's history. But like after this episode and the Super Metroid episode that we both were on, it really seems like hard to dispute that Yokoi probably deserves a spot in the Nintendo Mount Rushmore. Like he's just done so much stuff in his career. Like the Game Boy is probably his crowning achievement, being a part of that team. But like you heard all the stuff that I listed off, like he's got to be on there, right?
Oh, for sure. And really taking Nintendo into a more technological toy era with those early inventions you talked about. I mean that
The Ultra Hand.
Ultra Hand was a huge hit. The light rifle, like the beam rifle, like those were pretty big breakout hits in the day, and really helped convince Yamauchi to go more into that direction. So we owe a lot to Yokoi for sure.